And then she turns around and sees his body hanging over the car. I can even remember the project I was working on in that art class of 2004 when I first heard this story. We were all cutting photos into strips. Leaving out every other fragment, we'd glue those strips down and try to recreate the missing pieces with graphite drawings, a perfect exercise for middle schoolers. But at that moment, I'd completely forgotten my drawing. I was hooked. I wasn't allowed to watch horror movies as a kid, but I was already showing the signs of a horror addict in the making. The kids sitting at the same table had no such limitations. No, they were able to watch whatever movie they wanted the weekend before, then come into school and clumsily recount stories like Child's Play or A Nightmare on Elm Street. And I would soak it up, pestering them for as many details as I could get. But horror movies weren't the only source of spooky stories. There were also urban legends. But the recounting of these stories was rocky, to say the least. In every story, without fail, the narrator would tell a part of the story, but another kid would cut them off with a correction. When this pattern happens 20 or more times, stories end up smashed together and jerkily disentangled over and over again. But we were all quite tenacious, and we always managed to stumble through each legend. Urban legends held a special kind of reverence amongst kids our age. Horror movies were widely known to be almost entirely fictional, leaving us untouchable to the terrifying villains on our blockbuster rentals, but urban legends were held up by what seemed to be everyone as true. But looking back, I also realized that urban legends posed a kind of initiation. I remember urban legends as being the first time that my child mind was confronted by what human beings could do to each other. The concept of murder was a murky one, as I didn't have access to true crime documentaries or even the news. But these supposedly true urban legends had all kinds of violence in them, directed at teens, women, and children. This discovery sparked a kind of obsession in me, a need to figure out which versions of the stories were the real truth. In the years to come, I'd leap on every opportunity I had to grill storytellers sitting at bonfires, needling them to tell their versions of the same stories. I slowly built up a collection of small details that changed from person to person, area to area. Suffice it to say, this season is going to extensively cover the first horror stories that we grew up with, urban legends. Welcome back, or welcome, to a third year of Back Away Slowly. You know, this topic is simultaneously easier and yet more difficult to write about than the previous seasons. For Season 1, while we can debate whether ghosts exist or not, the stories that cycle about haunted locations are fairly consistent, with maybe a few changes or extra details. For Season 2, the folklore or historic belief of monsters allowed for quite a bit of exploration and research. But urban legends are simultaneously incredibly old, yet remarkably new. Depending on the urban legend, we could be hearing the exact same story that our parents grew up with decades ago. But other urban legends appear to have popped up within the past 50 or so years, but if you dig past the outer veneer, you'll find a long train of evolution that goes back centuries. And then there's the seemingly insignificant changes to the same urban legend, mostly depending on cultural areas. Variation with any urban legend is extensive, from small details to characters to entire plot lines. And then, the primary medium of urban legends, that being oral storytelling, is, in itself, incredibly fluid and subject to change. All of this makes it incredibly difficult to trace the source of these stories, though figuring out the significance of those changes for an area or a period of time can be quite interesting and rewarding. But urban legends have also outgrown the bonfire setting. We see hints or even entire stories within our favorite movies and TV shows. If you pay attention when reading spooky Reddit stories, you can see quite a few users reverse engineering urban legends to create their own popular story, or some people outright claiming that they experienced the original urban legend firsthand, despite the story going back decades. Even the sentiment of certain urban legends can be seen in the collective public zeitgeist. But what is it about these stories that have allowed them to survive for so long? How am I familiar with a story that my grandparents were aware of? Stories that'll undoubtedly be told to thousands of children in the future. Fortunately for you all, I put the research time in for you. Books, academic papers, documentaries, TV shows, films, and a very special guest. We have a lot to get to. Before we get into specific stories, we need to talk about urban legends in general. First things first, we need to define what urban legends are and what they aren't. And not to worry, you can find all of these terms in the show notes and on the podcast website. Let's start with myths. In 1973, Richard Dorson defined a myth as a specific oral story that involves the supernatural and is fully believed by the storyteller. The gods of Mount Olympus? That's an example of a myth. Now, legends are very similar to myths, but there are several important differences. Legends are also believed by the narrator and their audience, but they're from a much more recent time. While believed to be true, they're viewed as less sacred than myths. Veering away from gods, legends usually tell stories about human actions and events. And while some legends do include elements of the supernatural, like ghosts and fairies, the main purpose is to preserve historical culture. The stories of King Arthur, Robin Hood, and Johnny Appleseed are examples of legends. Folklore is a larger category that can contain all of these terms. It may contain religious or mythical elements, but it's primarily an oral tradition that concerns itself mostly with the traditions and culture of daily life in a specific region, focusing on more practical narratives. As N.E. Genge states, quote, "Folklore is history, but it's often the history of how given people perceive themselves and others, not just facts or dates." Author Mary Cantrell argues that urban legends are a kind of modern folklore. We also need to talk about rumors and gossip, as urban legends frequently spread in the same way that rumors and gossip do. While both words have a generally negative reputation, they actually serve several fairly important functions in society. Gossip can entertain people. It can strengthen friendships through conversation. It provides topics for individuals to talk about. It can give a chance to reminisce and share a group's history with each other or newcomers. It can create a space to share informal rules. And it allows for the introduction of outsiders into a group by discussing how the group functions, or to inform others of the group's social boundaries. Gossip comes from a deep need to connect, to belong. Quote, "Isolation is aversive, maladaptive, and unhealthy. A core human motive is therefore to belong, to form and maintain relationships with others. People do this by seeking to create, fit into, sustain, or recast a network of social relationships for themselves. Gossip helps them do that." Gossip can give you a heads up about what topics to avoid when talking to this person. What's the best dish to bring to a Sunday potluck? And even to pass along a warning about what people or locations within the community are potentially dangerous. You can find countless articles about how the word and practice of gossiping has been used to shame women. The more that women could be isolated by men, the easier they were to control. If women could talk to each other, they could warn each other about what men not to get involved with, giving each other a heads up about dangerous behavior. Because of this, quite a few men really didn't like that women were bonding and sharing information. Soon enough, gossip became an abhorred activity that only catty, aggressive, nosy women participated in. But that's a topic for another time. Moving on to rumors. Rumors are bits of unverified statements that are shared in an attempt to foresee and manage danger. Rumors don't have a plotline. They have no real beginning, middle, and end. Again, they're more like potentially helpful fragments than an actual story. Quote, rumors function to make collective sense in an ambiguous situation. In undefined contexts, people attempt to make sense first individually by thinking in terms of their own personal framework of understanding. When this doesn't work, they begin proposing, discussing, and evaluating informal hypotheses with one another, collectively. These collective hypotheses and the associated discussions are rumor. Thus, in ambiguous, unclear, or confusing situations, people feel a need for understanding, and rumor serves a collective sense-making function. People discuss rumors so as to come to a group interpretation of their situational context. In other words, when people are faced with a situation that they don't entirely understand, or maybe they don't have all of the relevant information, people get uncomfortable with that uncertainty. So they'll go to their peers to discuss it and come to a consensus. This can build a selective perception and emotions that are now attached to that situation, whether the conclusion they've reached is entirely accurate or not. It's a form of reclaiming control when we don't know the entire truth. For example, if there's a rumor going around that the water dam is about to break, it gives an opportunity for people to evacuate before a disaster might happen. Another example would be hearing that a specific deodorant causes breast cancer. This gives an opportunity for people to choose a different deodorant, thereby avoiding danger. When we look at the relationship between rumor and urban legend, a rumor implies that there's a falseness to some of, or sometimes the entire rumor itself. Therefore, an urban legend is a way to package a warning in a way that it'll be taken seriously, and therefore it's more likely to be passed along. Rumors are specifically created to try to make sense of ambiguous situations, whereas urban legends are an attempt to find meaning in the world. The term urban legend isn't even that old. The phrase was first used in 1968 by Richard Dawson. By 1979, Professor Jan Harold Brunvand was using the term in print. Here's a heads up that you're going to hear Brunvand's name a lot. He's frequently regarded as the father of urban legends, and has a good number of books published. So let's see what he has to say about it. Brunvand defines urban legends as, quote, fictional folk narratives that contain a plot, are told over a considerable time period, and employ an ironic twist as a symbolic message. The ironic twist creates a situation in which poetic justice occurs, and the protagonist gets his or her just desserts. Even though we call them urban legends, the stories don't have to happen in an urban area. The term urban legend was made to separate urban legends from pre-industrial times folklore. Urban legends are modern in that they mainly involve contemporary subjects, like hitchhiking, technology, telephones, etc., as opposed to knights, witches, and sleeping princesses. Despite the focus of the story including modern elements, the timeline always seems to be uncertain. Did the story happen yesterday? A week ago? A month before? Who knows? Even when the story does mention a time frame, it's always a span of time. These legends aren't necessarily untrue, at least not completely, but they're often distorted, exaggerated, or sensationalized. In fact, sociologists argue that an urban legend, in order to count as an urban legend, must be viewed as true, but it's always removed from the primary source. The story comes from a friend of a friend, or an uncle's second cousin. You get the gist. But it's easier for listeners to hear the urban legend and to think along the lines of what Genge writes in his book, Urban Legends. Quote, why would this person's friend tell such an outlandish story if it wasn't true? No one wants to be caught in a lie, especially an easily exposed lie, a stupid lie. The social embarrassment, the listener assumes, would heavily deter anyone from telling a stupid lie in the first place. The more often we hear these stories, though, the more the phrase, where there's smoke, there's fire, comes to mind. And let's face it, quote, although many people won't admit it, even to themselves, The fact of the matter is that most of us like a good story more than we like the truth, as stated in a book hilariously titled, "This Is Not a Hoax." As an interesting side note, in the UK, urban legends are sometimes referred to as WTSs. I'll give you a second to try to guess what that stands for. But don't feel bad, you were never going to guess. This stands for whale tumor stories. It originates from a story that took place during World War II. Naturally, as happens with any war, food was fairly scarce, so people weren't exactly being picky with where their meat came from. Supposedly, a housewife opened a tin of whale meat, but the stench of it almost made her pass out. Apparently, the meat was discovered to be a tumor that had grown on the whale, but had somehow gotten through the food packaging system. Anyways, urban legends are also incredibly migratory and adaptable. Whereas something like a myth or a rumor are usually fairly isolated to a specific community or culture, there are quite a few urban legends that hop from community to community, or even manage to leap across countries. From there, the story can evolve and morph in response to the needs of the community or the viewpoints of the region it's traveled to. And one element of urban legends that we'll see over and over again is this. Quote, "In a general way, our urban legends often depict a clash between modern conditions and some aspect of a traditional lifestyle." But again, why do these stories stick with us? Chip and Dan Heath of Stanford University wrote about why some ideas survive and why others die, how ideas stick, coming up with 6 principles of, quote, sticky ideas. 1. Simplicity. These ideas need to be simple yet profound. They need to make a few good points that people will remember and agree with, without getting too complicated. 2. Unexpectedness. The story needs to have a twist, or an element that wasn't expected in order to surprise the audience and make it memorable. 3. Concreteness. The story should be clear and concise, limiting the potential for confusion or ambiguity. 4. Credibility. Make it believable. 5. Emotional. The story or moral needs to prompt your audience to feel something. Otherwise, why would they care? And 6. Narrative. The story needs to be just that, a story. Stories stick in the human mind far more than a simple statement or factoid. Directing those 6 principles towards urban legends, Brunvant suggests that in order for an urban legend to survive, it needs 3 characteristics: the appeal of a good story, a foundation of truth, and some kind of meaningful message conveyed with an ironic twist of fate. And I think both of these conclusions are true. Genge states, quote, "Facts alone can't turn a what-if style scenario into a full-fledged urban legend. If no one cares about a topic or finds it relevant, legends about and knowledge of that topic slowly fade from public memory." After all, if your statements or story don't really say anything, why would anyone bother to remember it? Bernard Guerin and Yoshihiko Miyazaki take this concept a little bit further. They highlight that formatting information as a short story is more memorable to a general audience, specifically in a social storytelling setting, like around a campfire. And while urban legends aren't necessarily the most believable, depending on which urban legend you're telling, their shocking details or narrative twists stick in the mind. The stories are often told collaboratively as well, much like in my middle school art class. People chime in with details they'd heard about, or interrupt to say, no, it happened in this city. This constant shuffle, though messy, allows for audiences to occasionally dip into the storyteller role. This cooperative effort also makes the resulting story far more memorable, since you, as a listener, were a part of it. Even if the story gets out of hand, or too fantastic, the entertainment value is even more relevant. But often these stories are fantastic in a horrific way, creeping into our psyche by using very real fears. Quote, "It hits us deep in the gut. It's the troll under our bridge, the plague waiting to take our children. This kind of cooperative storytelling is very similar to how folklore is passed on. Overlapping oral details allow facts to slip and slide around, to fall through the cracks, or for new elements to be introduced. After all, people don't memorize stories verbatim. They're reconstructed around the main concept, further incorporated with bits and pieces of folk narratives and cultural belief. In this way, the story stays fairly consistent at its core, but its details vary every time. Those variations spread across cultural regions. Then those new versions venture further beyond the boundaries of that community, and so on. But this continuous cycle also allows for stories to evolve across time. This shifting folklore can shed thin layers to morph into a reflection of what's interesting or relevant in the day it's being told. Where word of mouth and letters were once the only ways to talk to each other, over the course of decades, more forms of communication rose to popularity. And with the advancement of technology, those forms were able to be delivered faster than ever thought possible. With the rise of television, film, the internet, and streaming, the need to be in a social setting in order to hear or tell a story isn't really necessary anymore. You can express your thoughts and opinions with the touch of a button. In under a minute, you can find a link to a YouTube video that tells scary stories. It's no longer a requirement to be physically present around others in order to have the once social experience of entertainment. Quote, "While our pioneer ancestors may have had to rely heavily on oral traditions to pass the news along about changing events and frontier dangers, surely we no longer need mere folk reports of what's happening, with all their tendencies to distort facts." And sure, you'd think that with the rise of newspapers, printed books, and eventually the internet, that we wouldn't really have to worry about the distortion of facts, since you can now copy and paste information instantly, verbatim. But I think that we all know by now that that's not true. As well, people are far more inclined to contribute negative elements of a story, be it negative beliefs about a story itself or the people in it. And because it's being retold on the internet, there's the possibility for the storyteller or commenter to remain anonymous and escape accountability for their biases, or their changes to the story. This evolution of folklore into digital fields would give rise to a new term coined by Russell Frank: net lore. But we have to give credit where credit is due, and acknowledge that the internet can also be used to debunk contemporary legends. We might have access to hundreds of people who lived in the area where the urban legend supposedly happened, and who might have more reliable information than what the legend currently has. We can access decades of newspaper articles, through which we can verify events. This is, of course, quite a tangled web to have to sift through, but it's still a level of information that's never been available in the history of humanity. Through all of this, urban legends have managed to cling onto this much more physically isolated society. It's shifted from oral storytelling to newspapers and books, then slipping into emails, popping up in blogs, jumping to social media posts, message boards, and more. This long game of hopscotch would eventually give rise to something that may be surprisingly familiar: meme theory. Yeah, that's right, you heard me. M-E-M-E theory. Believe it or not, a meme meant something far before what we think we know it as today. All the way back in 1976, Richard Dawkins defined meme theory. The theory describes how, similar to a gene, a piece of culture also has the ability to replicate and mutate whenever it's passed from one person to another. When a story is retold, a new replication is born, which is altered through cultural mutation, creating a meme. Similar to the 6 qualities for an idea to stick, Dawkins outlines 3 main elements required for a meme to survive. 1. Longevity. The memory of a good story can stick with a single person for an entire lifetime. therefore increasing the possibility that someone will remember and retell that story. 2. Fecundity. This refers to the ability for a meme to spread amongst a population. It can be measured by studying how many people on the street are familiar with the same meme or urban legend, and then tracking an urban legend's purpose and relevance within the culture. 3. Copying fidelity. This is the ability for a meme or story to evolve instead of staying static and potentially forgettable. Of course, today, people mostly assume a meme is just a funny post that's shared, edited, and reshared for comedic value. However, memes are still widely regarded in the academic world as a snapshot of culture, not strictly limited to humor or satire. So think about that the next time you see a meme online. Whether we like it or not, they're all snapshots of our period and culture. But let's go back to why these stories are being told in the first place. Aside from larger, broader reasons, there are a few outliers that I think are worth talking about. One very common reason is that certain communities will adapt urban legends in order to pass on a message of their own liking. These same communities may also point to urban legends as a reason for why the community has certain guidelines or beliefs that they think should be followed by the general population. An example of this happens within religious communities. Christian communities in particular have pointed to the urban legends about children being molested by satanic groups in order to justify their own rejection of music genres, clothing aesthetics, or video games. And unfortunately, there are real-life consequences to using urban legends as the basis for belief or as a call to action. For the satanic group Urban Legends, it traveled to the UK, where the authorities took the story seriously. This eventually tore apart innocent families, particularly in the Orkney Islands community. This would continue on to South Africa, where a fundamentalist Christian chief of police believed the legends about satanic cults. The consequences wreaked on the community in response to their misplaced trust were devastating. Some of these beliefs veer more into folklore than into urban legends. Like the belief within the Christian church where if you weigh the human body upon death, the loss of a certain amount of weight accounts for the soul leaving the body. As author Nick Harding states, quote, "A deliberate fabrication designed to persuade a population to trust in the church and unquestioning faith." In other words, these legends or beliefs can be used to persuade people to believe that a specific group has great power, possibly convincing people to join said group. The next reason for passing on urban legends is actually for commercial influence. There are plenty of urban legends that revolve around consumer products. Stories are planted and encouraged in order to sully the name of a competitor's products. If you make an urban legend about a Kentucky Fried Rat, that doesn't exactly look very good for KFC, so you'll probably go to one of their competitors. Quite a few stories we'll take a look at will lean heavily in one direction regarding how it wants the audience to perceive or utilize sex, or even whether or not it should be enjoyed. In the darkest stories, some sexual urban legends are used in order to tarnish and further isolate a minority group. There are plenty of stories about how homosexuals are dangerous. These stories in particular rose to prominence during the AIDS epidemic. Unfortunately, this means that these urban legends were used not as a bonding or empathetic exercise, but as a way to isolate a group of people that really could have used some support and compassion. I didn't really explore the commercial or strictly sexual urban legends, but if you're interested in further reading, I'll have all of my sources available on the podcast website. But by far, one of the most common reasons for urban legends to be spread is to tell them as a morality tale. Since stories are told by human beings, stories are inevitably patched up and adjusted to align with what's viewed as good or bad by the narrator. The choices that certain characters make, and the consequences that come from those choices, are very intentional. Even with how the story's told, it's almost impossible to completely remove the perspective and opinions of the storyteller. This is more easily shown in an oral retelling where you hear the speaker's tone of voice. You can see the expression on their face, both of which communicate what they personally think about the events in their story. Even online, a writer's choice of words when they type out a story can reveal their opinions. In these morality tales, the story often follows a character trying to get something morally dubious, like money or sex. These characters avoiding or bending community morals in order to get it. In the process of chasing or even acquiring that goal, an ironic twist happens as a direct consequence to that character's desire. In essence, be careful what you wish for. He should have known better. She got what she deserved, etc. The girlfriend, babysitter, or roommate shouldn't have been left alone. Even when she was left alone with no support, if only she'd asserted herself, she might have survived. This is interesting because it immediately allows us to see the target of the story's moral lesson, and it's most commonly the victim. In this way, urban legends are a lot like fairy tales. If you take a closer look, you'll realize that there aren't a whole lot of fairy tales that aren't told with the strict purpose of guiding malleable minds. We're going to jump back to a previous concept, which is that the telling of stories, at their core, is a very social activity. Quote, "Everything we do requires the involvement of other people, directly or indirectly." What we find, then, is a huge range of ways of talking that promote the formation and maintenance of social relationships. People make jokes, tell stories, engage in collaborative conversations, talk about work, talk about the weather, complain, seek controversy, tell histories, denigrate enemies, praise each other, and talk about television. Rumors, gossip, and urban legends, therefore, figure as just a few of many forms of relationship-enhancing talk. These stories can influence others. They convince people to stop and listen. This sharing of information and stories creates a connection between the teller and the listener, potentially strengthening bonds that already tentatively existed. Participating in this exchange, especially in person, can be a very rewarding experience. It gives new people a foot in the door of a new group by giving them a low-pressure event to introduce themselves as an entertaining person. Telling stories encourages the exchange of information, even if the story isn't really true. If the story is horrifying or scary, it lets people express their anxieties, realize that other people share those fears, and sometimes to exchange tactics for how to stay safe. Telling a story allows for the narrator to feel valued, that their information has proven valuable. The narrator themselves, and the people who hear the story, also feel a sense of satisfaction that they're in the know together. It can spark a mild competition for who can tell a new or interesting story first. We see this online all the time. Who can be the first person to tell the new viral scary story? Who can contribute the most interesting let's not meet horror story on the Reddit forum? It's all about social currency, and where that wasn't always easy to ascertain in a world before the internet, now we have the like button counters for that. In summary, contemporary legends are a way of sharing, validating, and controlling anxiety. If you think about it, even if it is just a story, if a sequence of words can influence a person to change their own perceptions or behavior, that's kind of a magical thing. I'm not immune to this myself. When I was younger, I heard the urban legend about people hiding used, contaminated needles in public places in order to infect other people. The specific story that I heard was about people hiding needles in gas pumps so that when you'd clench the handle to pump the gas, you'd be pricked by a needle, permanently infected with some kind of illness. In the writing of this episode, I realized that how I pick up the gas nozzle at a gas station was specifically formed because of hearing that story when I was a teenager. I didn't even realize it, but I changed how I interacted with an element of the outside world, and I still do. The point is, these stories impact us far more than we think they do. The last reason is probably the most obvious: entertainment. We live in a time of numbness. In a world where we can have any information at the push of a button, where news headlines flash across our screens, and we scroll past them without even blinking, we seem to constantly be seeking some kind of stimulation. Stories are, naturally, one of the best ways to find that stimulation. You listen closely to a TikTok warning people about a faulty product or a person on the loose in the community. You send it to your friends, commenting about how smart or clueless the person in the video was. But within a few minutes, that tension eases, and you scroll on. But you'll definitely double-check the lock on your door that night. Genge comments on our seemingly universal desire to pursue dark topics. Quote, "Numerous tales of happy-faced child actors turning into pedophiles or serial killers or heavy metal rockers also play into those same ironies. We love twisted endings, and urban legends supply them." We're able to comfortably judge a character's decisions from a safe distance. What would we do in that situation? Would we walk outside to investigate the sound of a crying baby, or would we call the police? But more often than not, we naturally assume that our survival instincts would obviously see us through. And often these stories are fantastic in a horrific way, creeping into our psyche by using very real fears. Quote, "It hits us deep in the gut. It's the troll under our bridge, the plague waiting to take our children." Whether we know it or not, we play through dangerous scenarios in a variety of ways. In conversations with peers, sharing news headlines, discussing recent or historical events in a classroom, all as an exercise in education and preventing future catastrophes. But we also do this in another way, through one of the most popular forms of the urban legend in the modern day: movies. Take the 2002 movie The Ring, for example. Spoiler warning ahead. This film hinges upon a story being shared via a haunted video cassette tape. This continuous passing of a story and the consequences to witnessing that story is almost identical to how an urban legend spreads. This becomes even more relevant when you consider the later films in the series. In the sequels, duplicate tapes are spread to as many people as possible. It certainly reminds me of sharing an urban legend by a campfire. The movie created its own form of a faux urban legend, asking the audience to believe that it truly exists. A movie such as The Blair Witch had an incredibly energetic marketing campaign to convince people that the movie was real, creeping into urban legend territory. And these fabricated urban legends have grabbed a certain amount of power in the real world that's difficult to deny. Hundreds, if not thousands of people believed that the three main actors in The Blair Witch were actually missing or dead. When it comes to urban legends, how many of us have immediately deleted an email that threatened us with tragedy if we didn't pass it on to 10 people? How many of us have refused to engage in the Bloody Mary ritual? And how many of us, if given a haunted cassette tape, would actually watch it? Urban legends have created the spine of countless horror franchises. Scream, Candyman, I Know What You Did Last Summer, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, urban legend. The list goes on. Films packed with hook-handed killers, lonely roads, babysitters left to fend for themselves, women in peril, and so on. Then you have films like Psycho and The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which are based on known killers. The movies are pointedly filmed in the light of day, communicating to the viewer that the sun isn't enough to deter the evil hiding out there. The lessons communicated by classic horror movies aren't exactly what you'd call subtle. Aside from the obvious "you have sex, you die" moral, there are more specific lessons. In The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a group of traveling teens break the social taboo of trespassing in someone's home without acknowledgement or permission. Because they overstep this residential boundary, they therefore earn their deaths, however gruesome. The added nugget of basing both films partially on the real-life murders by Ed Gein just adds a note of mild authenticity that sticks with an audience. Now, we'll continue with specific films in a minute, but I need to mention a new term: ostension. Ostension refers to how people act out themes or events from a folk narrative or urban legend. So instead of telling a story, ostension is when you show or replicate it. This includes movies. Or if you got your candy checked for poison or razor blades, you participated in ostension. This also includes real-life copycat crimes based on an urban legend. Pseudo-ostension is the process of imitating the outlines of a legend, but as a hoax. So if a group of teenagers goes to a local haunted location and one of them dresses up as a ghost to scare the shit out of their friends, that's an example of pseudo-ostension. Proto-ostension is when someone appropriates a contemporary legend by saying that it happened to someone they personally know, or even that it was their own experience and story. The creepy guy who called the babysitter, I was the babysitter. And finally, one of the most common activities of all, legend tripping. Legend tripping is when a group takes a trip to where a haunting, tragedy, or other event happened. So, that group of teens going to the local haunted location, legend tripping. A team of ghost hunters going to a haunted asylum, legend tripping. You go to a local cemetery and reenact satanic rituals, legend tripping and ostension. I explain this because these concepts will keep coming up, but for now, it means that all of the horror movies we're going to talk about are a form of ostension. But what movies, you ask? How about Candyman from 1992? Candyman immediately evokes the memory of the razor blades found in Halloween candy, acts of violence in a public washroom, and a few glimmers of the Hookman. And, of course, you summon him by saying his name 5 times into a mirror, which I'm sure sounds very familiar. What about Urban Legend from 1999? While the title seems a little on the nose, this movie knew exactly what it was doing. There are parts of the film that take place in a classroom, where students discuss and debate the nature of urban legends. Hell, the main concept of the movie itself follows how an urban legend could inspire a real-life crime. And of course, the film is full of ostensive practices. Spoiler alert for a 26-year-old movie. Michelle is killed in a reenactment of the legend from The Killer in the Back Seat. Damon is killed in the scenario of the boyfriend's death. Tosh is murdered in a representation of Aren't You Glad You Didn't Turn On the Light? Natalie and Brenda conduct a variation of the Bloody Mary ritual. Professor Wheeler is found dead in the trunk of a car, mimicking the death car legend. Natalie is almost killed in the act of the kidney theft story. And if we hop over to television, the entire premise of the show Supernatural, at least for the first couple of seasons, is ostension. Sam and Dean travel around the country to confront monsters and urban legends. But we'll wait a little bit to get into the specifics. All of this to say, the last and arguably largest reason for urban legends is to combat fear. Rumors, gossip, folktales, and urban legends about horror, anxiety, and danger are by far the most popular for a reason. And sure, most of us view these stories as fictional, but the real-life source of urban legends nestles uncomfortably in the pit of our stomachs and the back of our minds. Everyone has at least one urban legend that's stuck with them for their whole lives, the story that they just can't shake. What story a person's scared of can reveal a lot about an individual and what they fear in particular. By listening to these stories, we feel informed on how to prevent said tragedy from happening to us. And by telling these stories, we feel like we've done a public service by warning other people about what they need to protect themselves against. Joshua Missner organized 60 urban legends into 3 main categories in an effort to understand the most common themes. The first of the 3, which encompasses 58% of the 60 legends he collected, was told with the purpose of communicating a warning to the listener. The second largest theme took up 38% of the 60 stories, being a call to action. These stories would communicate a behavior that a listener should either not engage in or stop doing. A study team from Stanford University and Duke University found that a psychological analysis of rumors provided two explanations for why legends survive: information and emotion. The informational part is pretty obvious. Legends can provide conceivably useful, practical, or social information that's valuable. The emotional side is that a group will feel an emotion connected to a legend, a story that's frequently saturated by anxiety and fear. In some rare instances, that fear is boosted by a recent or past event, like a natural disaster or other tragedy. Researchers Joel Best and Gerald Horiuchi concluded in 1985 that there are three reasons for an urban legend to exist. First is that urban legends serve as a kind of public service announcement, functioning as a messenger to comment on a social problem that needs to be fixed. Secondly, Best and Horiuchi suggest that urban legends may offer a brace against collective hysteria. The story acts as a kind of pool in which a community can pour all of its anxiety, all of its panic. Putting those fears into a structured narrative allows the opportunity for listeners to offer constructive responses, or even solutions. In the journal article Modern Legend and Rumor Theory, Patrick Mullen hypothesizes that every society has building tension. This can be stressors of everyday life, the lack of functionality in the community, or sometimes a natural disaster. Telling urban legends is a way to emotionally discharge that stress, diffusing it back into the community. Sharing these stories offers an opportunity to find support with each other, that the dangers of those stories really is scary, that those fears are rational to have. It creates support and validation for those anxieties and feelings. A collective agreement that, yeah, treating this topic with caution is a priority for all of us. Another interesting side note is that studies have noted an increase in rumors around times of war, both within troops and civilians, which, after learning that storytelling helps to diffuse stress, isn't all that surprising. Back to Best and Horiuchi. Their last reason for why urban legends exist is because a story can reveal a gap formed by a lack of social organization that could defend against the events in an urban legend. For instance, the fears of a razor blade and candy apples suggests that there aren't enough defenses between children and sadistic adults. But let's put a microscope on a community. Who specifically contributes to urban legends? As I'm sure you figured out by now, we've all participated at some point, either as the teller or the listener. But the biggest group of participants are naturally teenagers. Colleges in particular usually have their own urban legends, passed from upperclassmen to lowerclassmen. It's a kind of initiation ritual, where upperclassmen grow immune to the fears of the legend as they attend school longer. But incoming freshmen are always susceptible to a spooky urban legend. Because of this constant cycle, the legend never truly dies, continuously told to newcomers as the older students leave. While some sources try to claim that gruesome legends are mainly shared by deviants or delinquents, that's just not true. One of the coolest parts of urban legends is that teenagers of all social classes and education levels have common knowledge of them, so they can share and understand those stories with each other. The appeal of a good scare and a good story is universal. No matter who you are, how much money you grew up with, what area of the world you're from, you'll just as happily sit side by side in front of a fire to hear a spooky legend. And that's been true for centuries. And I find that there's something so amazing and beautiful about that. A kind of connection across time. Hopefully this has given us a good crash course on the basics of urban legends, as well as their purpose in our culture. Over the course of this season, I'll dredge up stories from your childhood, pull out my fine-tooth comb, and we'll take a look at their origins, influences, moral lessons, and even the events inspired by them. So lock your doors, turn away from the mirror, and don't take abandoned roads. We've got a lot of ground to cover. But I won't be doing it entirely alone. Take a listen to this.
Pennies have long been associated with luck, in this case really bad luck, but normally very good luck. If you find a penny, pick it up, and all day you'll have good luck. If you pass up a penny, you'll lose $1. If you find a penny that's heads up, it's particularly good luck and you should carry it with you as a charm. A bride should always have a penny in her shoe, and following the wedding, she should take that penny and get it made into a piece of jewelry, a pendant or a bracelet or something like that.
If that sounded familiar, it's because it probably is. While I'd love to talk to any Mythbuster, that voice in particular belongs to Heather Joseph Witham. She's a folklorist who consulted on the TV show Mythbusters in the first 2 seasons.
The idea is that if there's a large ship that's going to be sinking, the passengers need to get as far away from the ship as they possibly can, because the ship will go down in the water and a tremendous suction will be created, and it will draw anyone and anything down with it. When the Titanic went down, we have numerous accounts of people who were swimming or who were on lifeboats, and they all said, our lives were saved because we had some strong men rowing the boat and we got far away from the suction of the boat sinking.
Her segments became a bit of an obsession for me. My favorite part of many episodes was, and still is, listening to her handful of minutes on screen, where she'd offer a bit of cultural context about the myths or urban legends that the team was attempting to bust. As a kid, I didn't really know that folklorists existed, that there was a job for hyperfixating on stories and how they influence people. But this proved me wrong.
Well, this narrative's been around for years, probably as long as high-altitude flying has been around. This also comes from this, dual fear of flying and guns. 2 things that can kill you, 2 things that you have little control over. So, you see this image enough, and we've probably seen it dozens of times in film. It does become rather real. It's a pretty startling image.
I was always disappointed when her segment ended, particularly when we didn't see her again in season 3. Well, what if I told you that she's agreed to chat with me? Professor Joseph Witham will be popping in every now and then to contribute some information across several episodes. So with all that planned, we dive into season 3. I'll see you next week.